I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, my colleague and friend, Anne Carlson. Anne is the Shirley Shapiro Professor of Environmental Law, and I'm delighted to say that Shirley Shapiro is also with us here today. Anne is also the co-director at our Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. This critical program is doing tremendous work for the future of the planet and is getting appropriate recognition for it. Last year, US News ranked the Emmett Institute and our environmental program number 5 in the country. We were pleased by that, though we think we deserve to be even a little higher yet, and we will be. What Anne and her colleagues are doing in this program is truly extraordinary, both in terms of policy work, in terms of teaching our students, and in terms of the kinds of scholarship and other kinds of engagement that they're participating in. And Anne is a prolific scholar and is working, actually, she's just starting a new book project, and she also speaks widely. In fact, last year, the US State Department invited Anne to give talks before environmental economists, regulators, and others in both Germany and Russia. That's right, Anne got to go on one of those very coveted faculty junkets to Siberia. So welcome Anne, we're delighted to have you.
So I'm going to try in my 12 minutes to talk about the most complex and pressing problem facing us in the next 50 years by talking about the state of climate and the problems that we face. And then I'm going to try to bring your mood up a little bit by talking about the Paris Agreement, which is the big international agreement that 189 countries entered into last December. And I have mixed feelings about the Paris Agreement, so your mood will be better, but you won't be exceedingly happy. But I'm going to end on an optimistic note, and that optimistic note is going to include some focus on some things that I think are really exciting, sometimes surprising, and give us some hope that maybe we can keep temperature increases to a manageable level over the course of the next 30 to 50 years. So with that, let me see if I can make this work and start with this slide. This is August. This is from August of 2016. Actually, it was just published a couple of days ago. August of 2016 was the hottest August on record. And it just followed all the other months before it. So July and June, and can I do this backwards? May and April and March. You look at the Slate headline down here. Slate says it was the 11th hottest month on record. NOAA actually says it was the 16th. In any event, the planet is hot. We are experiencing the effects already of greenhouse gas emissions that have accumulated in the atmosphere. Welcome. Nice to see new faces in the room. 2016 is hardly unusual. 2016, I think, will be the hottest month on record. One of the alarming things is that the rate of temperature increase is actually faster than it was even a few years ago. 15 of the past 16 years have been the hottest ever recorded. So there is no question that the Earth is warming. Here are temperature records from 1880 through I think about 14 or 15 that show the trend pretty clearly. And then what we've got is a kind of similar looking chart, although sharper there, starting at about 1950, of the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. And right now, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, this is taken from, you can see it's September 18th, 2016, so this is in real time. These things actually do fluctuate depending on the season of the year and so forth. But the levels we're seeing right now are the highest we've seen in 800,000 years. And if you're interested at the reception, I can tell you how we know that. And the big question, of course, is there a correlation between those rising temperatures and the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere? And the answer is pretty unequivocally yes. So let me just give you a couple factoids to tell you why the science seems so certain. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a UN-sponsored organization that includes all of the countries of the world. It includes Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia, not exactly big proponents of the idea that climate change is caused by fossil fuels. And yet those countries, along with every other participant in the IPCC process, say in their most recent assessment, warming is unequivocal. Human influence on the global climate system is clear. Couldn't be more straightforward than that. Observations of what's actually going on the ground confirm the predictions of the models, and in fact, in many respects, the observations of what's actually happening are worse than what the models were predicting even a couple of years ago. So we have some impacts that we're already feeling, and one of the most common and serious that we're experiencing really on a monthly basis around the globe are increasingly intense flooding and happening with more frequency. So this is the Louisiana floods of just last month, in which 13 people died. There was $9 billion in damage, thousands of people displaced from their homes. You can see this is even at the end of the storm. You can see just the accumulation of precipitation was just basically insane. I mean, people who were living there and talking about it just could not believe the volume of water coming out of the atmosphere. This is completely consistent with predictions that scientists have been making about what happens as the climate gets warmer, more moisture accumulates in the atmosphere, and we get more rain, and the rainstorms are more frequent and more intense. The Louisiana storm was the worst disaster since Superstorm Sandy, which many scientists believe was also more intense than what was expected, that would be expected in the absence of increasing temperatures. This is hardly, I had to pull out a bunch of slides because I have 12 minutes, but this is South Carolina last October, a 1,000-year flood event. This is Portland, Maine, after one of the worst storms on record last September. You may have heard yesterday, Minneapolis got 10 inches of rain overnight, so Minneapolis is experiencing terrible, terrible flooding. Flooding is hardly the only major problem that climate change is either causing or exacerbating. Oh, sorry, missed one. This is Chennai, India. 300 people died in this flood during the Paris negotiations. So as the global leaders were, convening to try to do something about climate change, there was, up-to-date news about the effects of climate change on weather. This is a picture of something we're all familiar with here. This is the California drought. This is taken in California. One of the interesting things about the most recent drought is not that we're getting less rain. In fact, we've had droughts that have very low amounts of precipitation that look a lot like this one. What's different about this now is that because the temperatures are higher, we're seeing much more rapid evaporation of the water. So the water supply is actually in worse shape, even with a drought that's somewhat similar to what we've had historically, and this is hardly the only place in the world that drought is occurring. Kenya and other places have experienced terrible, terrible drought. You might be wondering why I have a picture of Syrian refugees up here. Many observers believe that it was a water crisis because the Tigris-Euphrates water basin is rapidly being depleted, in part as a result of climate change. Many rural residents who could no longer farm moved to the cities of Syria, couldn't find jobs, and many observers think that this contributed to unrest that ultimately led to the Arab Spring and is actually now undermining Assad, leading to a giant refugee crisis. So one of the reasons that the United States military has been so outspoken about the problems of climate change and is so worried about the national security consequences of interference with things like water resources. This is wildfires, something we experience, of course, here in California, but this is Australia. Australia has actually added a new temperature color on their temperature charts. It's now purple for the number of days that are exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. They've had massive, massive problems with both drought and water. And this is Antarctica. So sea ice melting and glaciers melting, of course, are contributing to sea level rise. For a long time, it was thought that the Antarctic ice sheets were actually stable, but there is now very good evidence, including from one of the astrophysicists here on campus, that the western ice sheet is in fact beginning to melt. That will have enormous consequences for Southern California. Actually, where the ice melts matters in terms of where the oceans rise. Do I have you depressed yet? Okay, so let me tell you why this is such a hard problem to solve, and then talk about why it's rather remarkable that the countries came together in Europe and in Paris to achieve an agreement. So developed countries like the United States caused the problem of climate change. And we did so through actually very productive activity, through the burning of fossil fuels. which fuels virtually everything we do. We drive, we turn on the lights, et cetera. We emit carbon dioxide. The problem, however, is that in order to solve the problem going forward, we need to ask developing countries to actually change their sources of energy away from what we got to rely on to cleaner sources, renewable energy like solar and wind and so forth, at a time when that may still be more expensive, but it doesn't emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. That makes it an incredible political conundrum. And then on top of that, what you put in the atmosphere today actually causes a problem 10, 20, 40 years down the road, because greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere and stay up there for a long time. So what we burned 30 years ago is still causing problems today in increasing temperatures. So that, again, is a huge political problem. We're asking the developing world to make changes in their behavior that we didn't have to make. We have to change now, but we got to grow without thinking about the externalities, the environmental consequences that we are imposing on the planet. Nevertheless, last December, as I said, 189 countries came together and achieved the Paris Agreement, which is currently being ratified. And it's a really interesting treaty. I can't talk about it in great detail, but there are two things that I'll tell you that are interesting. One is that the global community committed to trying to keep temperature increases to below 2 degrees and to get close to 1.5 degrees, which is where scientists think we need to be to mitigate or to keep kind of in check the worst consequences of climate change. And the other thing the agreement did is, rather than imposing obligations from the top, countries voluntarily committed to what they will be willing to do. So it's an interesting process. It's the only thing that I think would have worked, particularly given that we have a US Senate that won't ratify a treaty. But it's an incredibly promising approach. Nevertheless, I'm going to keep you a little depressed here. If the current, so the INDCs are the country commitments that we achieved in Paris, if people actually implement, if the countries actually implement what they committed to, we're still committing ourselves to temperature increases of 3.5 degrees centigrade, which scientists think will absolutely wreak havoc on the planet. Right now, we've experienced a little under a degree centigrade, and we're already experiencing all sorts of problems. The 2-degree pathway there, you can see that's not even what the global community committed to. It committed to cutting even further than that. But you can see the gap between the current INDCs and what we actually need to do to accomplish a stabilized climate. Okay, I'm going to try now to be a little more optimistic. So why do I have any optimism that we might actually, if not accomplish the 1.5 degree temperature increase, get close? Well, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some important trends. And this one, I think, is probably the most promising. It's to some degree pretty well known, but you can see how much China, for example, is investing now in wind. They have lots of reasons to do so. Climate change is one of them. Air pollution is another. You can see what's happening in the United States. Massive wind capacity developed, particularly in the Midwest, which is where the wind actually blows most consistently. And you can see this, this is true. India has invested in wind and solar, US and solar. And what we're seeing is prices for a kilowatt hour of electricity are way cheaper than we thought they were going to be from renewable resources. That trend is going to keep going. And that's a really promising one, because this is entirely clean, greenhouse gas-free energy. So that's one promising story. Here's another promising story, which is, I think, a lot less well known. Brazil has led, but other jurisdictions have followed in stopping deforestation. And the reason deforestation is so important is because the trees and forests hold carbon. And if you cut them down, we release more carbon into the atmosphere. They've been incredibly successful. There are estimates that we've saved about 4 billion tons of greenhouse gases from going into the atmosphere. That's equivalent to what California emits. It's an extraordinary accomplishment and a story that's not very well told, and I'm hopeful will continue. And then there's the great state of California, which is now committed to new climate goals. We had climate goals for 2020. We've now extended them to 2030. California has innovating all over the place, and we've managed to do so and still maintain economic growth, maybe even accelerate economic growth as we grow a clean energy sector. And then I want to leave you on one final note, and that is, I think, the thing that makes me the most optimistic. And this is a group of UCLA Law students and 4 UCLA Law professors, including one who's in the audience, Kara Horowitz, who's here for her 15th year reunion. And we took them to Paris, and they represented a group of small island nations in technical talks during the Paris negotiations. It was an extraordinary experience. They are the people who we are training to be our environmental leaders. They were able to go because of the generosity of incredible people like the Shapiros and others, and they give me hope that we actually have a shot at beating this problem. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.